you, Pierre. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here a second time in such a short period. It's very nice of you to invite me. I'm going to talk tonight about my new book, Infrathin, an experiment in micropoetics. This is the cover of the book, came out a few months ago from the University of Chicago Press. And actually, I wrote this book in order to sum up many years' work on how to read. One of the hardest things is how to read, and especially how to read poetry. Everybody thinks, well, everybody can read, but in fact, they can't, because it's a question of reading carefully and reading differentially in a way, and reading in an infra-thin way. And also, I begin with a quote from Wittgenstein, who I've written about many times, and I love this quote. Hegel seems to me to be always wanting to say that things which look different are really the same, whereas my interest in showing that things which look the same are really different. We could argue in a way that poetry is the art of difference. And by that, I mean that poetry is the art that uses language in new ways, special ways, makes it strange, defamiliarizes language so that it becomes memorable. You remember it the way you do aphorisms or short little things and poems. And that means that you have to pay attention to everything pretty much, but especially the difference. And the artist who helped me the most in working out this problem is Marcel Duchamp, who I won't talk about tonight, the great avant-garde artist of the early 20th century. And he said, you can't define the infra-thin, you can just give examples. And here are some examples. And of course, they're meant to be purposely funny in a way. The warmth of a seat which has just been left is infra-thin. Sliding doors of the metro, the people who pass through at the very last moment, infra-thin. In other words, this tiniest little difference. Skip down a little bit. Let's look at the last one. The infra-thin separation between the detonation noise of a gun, very close, and the apparition of the bullet hole in the target is infra-thin. It happens so quickly. Or, and here are some more serious ones, the difference between the contact water and molten lead make with the walls of a given container is infra-thin. How different that is. And the most important one is the very one at the bottom here. The difference dimensional between two objects in a series made from the same mold is an infra-thin one when the maximum, and he puts in a question mark, of precision is attained. And what he means is that if we have a mold, an ordinary kitchen mold with different parts of the mold, and we pour whatever liquid in, and we think it's identical, it's never really identical. Something will always be slightly different, if for no other reason than that you change while you perceive it. Gertrude Stein was very interesting on this topic, and she analyzed, for instance, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. The more you say it, it doesn't stay exactly the same. You either get more tired of it, or you pay more attention, or you're distracted by something else. There's always something slightly changing. And Duchamp called this a kind of nominalism, a visual nominalism, no more generic, specific numeric distinction between words. And this next part is very important. Tables is not the plural of table. Ate has nothing in common with eat. Now, all he means by all that is that pay attention to tenses, pay attention to plurals. It makes a difference whether something is singular or plural. It makes a difference how something is said. We sort of think now that it's all just content, but clearly form is very important in how we perceive language. So no more physical adaptation of concrete words, no more conceptual value of abstract words. Don't just read them as concrete or abstract, because you really have to pay attention to each word. And I put at the bottom here, Verbivocovisual, which is James Joyce's term in Finnegan's Wake. But many of the poets adopted that. In other words, the poetry is not just a matter of words, but a matter of sound and a matter of the look on the page. Each thing is very important. Otherwise, it isn't really poetry. So poetry is also the art that poems can only be reread. They can't really be read. I don't particularly like poetry readings myself, because you go to a poetry reading and the poet gets up and reads and you hear it once and you either like it, sort of, you can make a fuss and not like it. But if it's really a good poem, you're not going to understand it till you read it the second time or even the third and begin to see what's really going on. In the book, I have chapters on Yeats, on Beckett, on Wallace Stevens, on John Ashbery and some more contemporary poets, but especially on Duchamp himself and Gertrude Stein, and on Ezra Pound, who to me is one of the most important modern poets, and on T.S. Eliot. If we have a minute, I'm going to talk about Eliot again a little bit tonight, but I'm going to talk about a different poet first in order to show you certain things, and that's the poems of William Carlos Williams, who is actually not in this book, but I just thought it would be interesting for you to see how this kind of thing works out. So this is a poem written in 1916 called The Young Housewife. I'm sorry, it's under the thing you can't, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, The Young Housewife. And it seems at first like a very casual little poem. At 10 a.m., the young housewife moves about in negligee behind the wooden walls of her husband's house. I pass solitary in my car. Then again, she comes to the curb to call the iceman, fishman, and stands shy, uncorseted, tucking in stray ends of hair. And I compare her to a fallen leaf. The noiseless wheels of my car rush with a crackling sound over dried leaves as I bow and pass, smiling. Now, the occasion for this poem was that Williams was a doctor, a busy pediatrician and general practitioner in New Jersey back in 1916 when he wrote this, and he drove in his car to work to the hospital. And on his way, he evidently, would observe this young woman. He didn't know her. And he doesn't know her, it's just the young housewife. It's nobody he knows. And he watches her. And this is just a kind of fantasy that he has watching her. And everything here depends on tone and on the way you understand the language. So it begins very casually. At 10 a.m., the young housewife, so perhaps somebody recently married, moves about in negligee. Now notice it doesn't say in her negligee or in a negligee, but in negligee. It seems as if that's her mode of being, in negligee. And then the line is cut after behind. Williams' line breaks are always very important. And in poetry, you must watch where the line breaks. And it looks as if it's her negligee behind, doesn't it? As if her behind is characterized by the negligee. And then you get this strange line behind the wooden walls of her husband's house. Well, the normal thing would be to say in her house. And of course, he doesn't know what she's really doing because he's just picturing it. He doesn't see her behind the wooden walls of her husband's house. He can't. He's just passing solitary in his car. So it's all his imagination. But the wooden walls of her husband's house suggest that the man is the owner, as he would have been back in 1916, and it's really his house, and he controls things. And it's also like the knight with his castle. This, in many poems, is a contemporary or a modern version of the medieval poem where the knight comes to the castle and adores the beautiful lady above who is married to somebody else and kneels and sings his prayer, the troubadour poems, the wooden walls of her husband's house, which is so awkward, really. And then I pass solitary in my car. Now, then he can see her, I guess, as he drives by. Then again, she comes to the curb to call the iceman. These were the days where you had ice for the ice box the refrigerator brought every morning by truck, and fish, fresh fish, the iceman, fishman, and stands shy, uncorseted. Now, he doesn't really know that she's uncorseted. He's just imagining, again, like the negligee, she's still a negligee, tucking in. And I love this line. When you come to tucking in, you think it's going to be tucking in her flesh, right? Inside the corset, but it's not. Tucking in stray ends of hair. But it has an erotic connotation, the stray ends of hair. And I compare her to a fallen leaf. Now, that is a very bizarre line, and you've moved from realism to what seems almost surrealistic. What do you mean I compare her to a fallen leaf? Now, I've had students sometimes who say, well, this is a rape fantasy. If he compares her to a fallen leaf and then he's about to ride over her in his car, that's disgusting. He really is thinking of raping her. But it's nothing that strong. You have to understand the tone. It's just whimsical. He's just sort of thinking, in a way. What can I do? And so there's that silly comparison because there's nothing about her that's like a fallen leaf at all. She's the opposite. She's very lively. She's moving around. She's alive. Anyway, he makes that statement. He would like her to be a fallen leaf, perhaps. And then the noiseless wheels of my car rush with a crackling sound over dried leaves, now as I bow and pass, smiling. Now, when you get to I bow and pass, smiling, that's just ordinary behavior. We all act correctly. And he doffs his hat, as one could these days, in the car and bows and passes, smiling. He doesn't know her. Just maybe like to know her, but he just bows and passes smiling. So it's the very slightest of fantasies about the young housewife. Nothing happens. He doesn't know her. He doesn't get to know her. He isn't making a grand statement about love or sex or really anything, but it is capturing a moment, a very special moment of a kind of daydream we all have on the ordinary drive to work in the morning, what he sees and what he fantasizes about a little bit and what she's like. And of course, we don't know what she's like at all. It's a free verse poem with 3 stanzas, first 4 lines, and then 11 lines altogether. And as I said, it is, for those who know the history of literature at all, it is in a way a very sly allusion to these troubadour poems where the knight is outside the castle and can't get to the maiden within. Okay, now I wanted to talk about, in the time that remains, about another, I have a minute, another Williams poem. And this one is called This Is Just to Say, and is quite famous. And it began with a note. This is a real note. This is a real note that Flossie Williams left for her husband, who always came home from the hospital in New York when he was a resident late at night. And he wasn't always just at the hospital. He went to parties at Walter Arensberg's house and would come in at 2 a.m. And who knows what went on at these parties. She was a little bit jealous. It's not quite clear. He seems to feel a little guilty, as you'll see in a minute. So here's her real note. This was a real note. Dear Bill, I've made a couple of sandwiches for you. In the icebox, you'll find blueberries, a cup of grapefruit, a glass of cold coffee. On the stove is the teapot with enough tea leaves for you to make tea if you prefer. Just light the gas, boil the water, and put it in the tea. Plenty of bread in the bread box and butter and eggs. I didn't know just what to make for you. Several people called up about office hours. See you later. Love, Floss. Please switch off the telephone. And here is the poem. See if I can lower this a little bit. Anyway, the poem is called This Is Just to Say. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. Now, what is the difference between the poem and her note, aside from this being lineated? But of course, the lineation does also make a difference. Again, watch the line breaks. It seems completely casual, and it seems like just ordinary conversation. But is it? And look especially at that last stanza. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. Nobody talks that way. We would say so sweet and cold. Nobody would quite say so sweet and so cold. But there's a reason for that stanza, and you can see how great it is. I've substituted for you. Where did I put this? I'm sorry, that should be here. It isn't. All right, suppose the last stanza were, I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, so nutritious. You would ruin the whole poem. You don't want to rhyme there, delicious, nutritious. Or suppose you had a last stanza that went, forgive me, I will try to behave myself a little better from now on. That would also be very silly because he isn't going to try to behave himself better. Now, first of all, the thing to note about this poem is that it's very intimate, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. This is written by a man who knows his wife very well. He knows what kinds of things she does. You were probably saving them for breakfast. So what is the big deal? And why does he say the plums that were in the icebox? She knows they were in the icebox. She put them there. But he seems to feel a little guilty. And we know that from the line, forgive me. Now, what about plums? There isn't much imagery in this poetry, nothing very difficult, but plums are not quite apples as in the Garden of Eden. It's not eating of the apple, but plums connote the behind, rear ends, breasts, perhaps. It's not peaches, it's not pears, but plums. It's a very ordinary fruit in a way, but juicy and delicious. And so he's leaving her that note and about saving for breakfast. So she's very organized and saves things for breakfast, but he isn't. And he says, forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold, as if that's an excuse, as if, well, you know, that's what I do. I eat plums. And it became a very famous poem, and other people copied it in various ways with this is just to say, and made funny things, you know, this is just to say such and such, but it is an icebox, a refrigerator note. That's all it really is. But by lineating it and making it so small and so spare and putting it only the necessary words, and then doing that repetition of so sweet and so cold, and the O picks up the O of delicious and forgive, it becomes a very lovely poem. Is my time up, Piera? Hello? Is my time up? I think so. Do I have time for one more?
Hey, no, you have time. Go ahead.
Okay, but I don't know what just happened to the screen because, okay, yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Now this again, remember we talked about T.S. Eliot, those of you who were here a few weeks ago, The Wasteland. One of the great examples of Infrathin, really the best, is T.S. Eliot. This is the early love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, one of the most famous poems in the language from this same period, the early 20th century, 1911. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. That became a very famous image. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Now that couplet is one of my favorite couplets in poetry. Of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, the repetition of night, the one-night cheap hotels, and every word counts. Suppose it were of unhappy nights in one-night cheap roadside houses or something, you would lose the whole rhythm. It's iambic pentameter, the rest has been free verse, but then you get the iambic pentameter of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, 10 syllables, 5 stresses, iambic pentameter, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Now, the oyster is an aphrodisiac, but here there are only oyster shells. The whole poem is very soporific, tired, and what's on the floor? Sawdust, the sawdust floor, and the oyster shells. And now look at the sound. Restless nights in one night, cheap hotels, look at the T's, and then sawdust, restaurants, and restaurants echoes restless. And restaurants, after all, were originally what the word restaurant means. Reste is a place to rest, is a place to stop and eat. So restless nights and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. The sound is absolutely perfect. The way he has put together the sound so that you have the repetition of the ST, restless, sawdust, oyster, you see that? And then the rhyme of hotels and shells. And it follows, let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats. What he's done in those 2 lines is it literally echoes. You hear the muttering retreats because the line is much shorter. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. You can just visualize the scene, but more than just visualizing, you can hear it, you can see it, and every consonant and vowel counts. And that's what Infrathin is all about. And that's what poetry at its best is all about, that every word counts. So that I'm always finding myself, when I pick up magazines today and read most poems, I just want to take a pencil and cross out most of each line where, you know, just I'm going to the store and doing, you know, you don't need all that. You need to make it condensed and moving so that people can remember these lines. And the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which is really a song about lack of love, a very sad poem, was to become one of the most famous poems in the language. I'll stop there. Thank you, Piera.
Thank you. Thank you very much.